As the United States prepares to welcome the world for the FIFA World Cup next month, excitement around the tournament is being matched by serious questions about what it means to host an event of this scale in the current political and social climate. Human rights concerns are not new to the World Cup. In Qatar in 2022, the tournament sparked global scrutiny over the treatment of migrant workers, restrictions on LGBTQ expression, press freedom, and broader civil liberties. Those debates pushed FIFA and host countries to confront a larger question: what responsibilities come with staging the world's biggest sporting event? Now, with matches set to take a place across the United States, Mexico, and Canada, many of those conversations are resurfacing in a different context. Questions are being raised about immigration and visas, border enforcement, public safety, freedom of expression, protection for journalists, the experiences of communities of color and immigrant communities, and whether host cities are prepared to ensure that millions of visitors and local residents feel safe and welcome. The large majority of matches will happen in the United States. Today's briefing will explore these issues through several lenses: the broader human rights framework surrounding the tournament, concerns related to immigration and civil rights, and what all of these may mean for communities across the United States as the country gets ready to welcome one of the largest global events in history. We are fortunate to have an outstanding panel with us today. Our first speaker is Minky Worden, Director of Global Initiatives at Human Rights Watch.
Thank you for having this event. And I think you've done a terrific job of setting up the ball that I will try to kick into the net. I wanted to say, first of all, that the starting point of the human rights catastrophes around the World Cup in 2018 in Russia and 2022 in Qatar, that is the right place to start, because this World Cup was supposed to be the largest, most inclusive World Cup, and perhaps most importantly, the first governed by a human rights framework. But it was governed by a human rights framework that was really put in place because of the human rights nightmares around the World Cups. And we're talking, with Qatar, we're talking about thousands of deaths, preventable deaths of migrant workers building stadiums, infrastructure, and hotel rooms. So that's our starting point. Since 2018, this was the first World Cup that was governed by a human rights framework. Human rights were in the bidding requirements for the countries that were bidding. And there was actually a human rights strategy that is a beautiful and yet meaningless document that was published. And I'll put some of these links in the chat for those who are covering this. But I think I'm going to concentrate my remarks on the United States, but I do want to flag that Human Rights Watch has published a reporter's guide to covering the World Cup. It's a 79-page book that actually covers the US, Canada, and Mexico, and deals with, for example, the problems of the disappeared in Mexico in the context of the World Cup. So I will put that in the chat, but concentrate my remarks on the US, because the US is hosting the majority of the matches. So that is 78 of the 104 matches. And in the United States, you can think of this as being like 78 Super Bowls. So the scale is something we haven't seen before, in part because it's a 48-team World Cup as opposed to the 32-team World Cup that we had previously in Qatar or Russia. And I think the other major thing is that in the US, the trends are bad and could get worse, the human rights trends. And the areas that I'll cover today are the US violent immigration crackdown, the lack of protections for LGBT people. And then my colleague, Katherine will also speak about the specific case and the lack of child safeguarding. I would say one of the biggest risks is that sports is going to be weaponized by the Trump administration. So this report actually has on the cover the FIFA Peace Prize, which some of the reporters on this line will remember is really a form of corruption. It's a prize that had no process whatsoever, no judges, no nominees. It was really awarded by Gianni Infantino to Donald Trump as a way of currying favor. And what's dangerous about something like the Peace Prize is that it says that FIFA is not going to enforce its own human rights rules. And that is what we've seen. So, in the time since this World Cup was awarded in 2018, the human rights and the immigration landscape has changed markedly. And our research shows the contrast between the rhetoric around this World Cup. I encourage reporters to visit Gianni Infantino, the president of FIFA's Instagram, where every single day he says this is going to be the largest and most inclusive World Cup. So we see that because of visa bans affecting dozens of countries, including World Cup qualifiers like Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Haiti, and Iran. So there are full visa bans in place that will mean that this is not truly a World Cup. And then there are also the dangers that could affect worker communities, immigrants, and host city communities. And one of the proposals that Human Rights Watch has put forward with the support of groups like the Sport and Rights Alliance, Dignity 2026, is we're calling for an ICE truce. And an ICE truce is modeled on the so-called Olympic truce, which means that for the duration of the event, ICE should not be rounding up and separating families in the context of the World Cup. And our biggest concern, of course, is that the World Cup itself, it's in 11 host cities in the United States. The World Cup should not become an ICE enforcement epicenter. Already, hundreds of thousands of people have been arrested in the US since January 2025 to today. But this and the attractiveness of the World Cup. So families, and particularly immigrant families, love the World Cup. And Human Rights Watch has interviewed people in host cities, in communities that are affected. And we've had people say to us, I don't care if I get arrested or deported. I am going to follow my team. I love the World Cup so much. And when we hear that, it's very concerning, because the conditions inside the detention facilities and the permanence of being separated from your family and being deported is something that is a big concern. I did want to add that members of Congress have also asked for a pause in ICE operations. U.S. Congressmember Nellie Poe of New Jersey, whose district includes the MetLife Stadium. We have some indication. We've pressured FIFA to use its power with the Oval Office to do this and the White House Task Force. And we have some indications that FIFA has actually taken this up. So I'd be happy to take questions on any of these activities, and in particular, any questions about dangers to journalists. Journalists also can be affected by visa bans. Journalists also should absolutely take measures to protect themselves, including their cell phones, laptops, and other work devices. So we're concerned about every stakeholder that is touched by this World Cup. It's a workplace for athletes. For fans, they could be in danger both at the stadiums and at fan zones and at watch parties. And then finally, journalists and others are at risk because the World Cup is a workplace for them, and it's not at all clear that they're going to be able to get the accreditation that they need to get into the country, and that they may also face dangers covering protests or other things at the event.
Thank you, Minky. Well, we were chatting before we started about the accreditations and what's happening in the area of media. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, just very quickly, it's not only the largest World Cup in terms of fans, duration. The duration is June 11 to July 19. FIFA estimates it will be 50,000 accredited journalists, both accredited by FIFA and accredited by the host cities. But we also there are hundreds of thousands of other journalists who may be covering these events in the US, Canada, and Mexico. The risks come in various ways. One, in crossing borders. So journalists may have to cross, in order to follow a team, you may have to cross a border from Mexico City to Dallas to Toronto. So crossing borders is always a danger point, both for fans and for journalists. There are many journalists who are not protected by the magic FIFA accreditation badge. That means they can't get into the stadiums to do their jobs. It means that if they're covering, for example, a protest on the perimeter of the stadiums, they might also, as we saw, I'll put a link to a report that Human Rights Watch did about a crackdown on protests in Los Angeles. They could get tear gassed, beaten up, and arrested. And we've seen journalists covering protests in Minnesota, Los Angeles, and
Yeah.
Chicago have experienced extreme violence from U.S. authorities. So we are concerned that FIFA has not put in place the correct protections for journalists to do their job as they are required to do by their own human rights rules.
Minky, thank you. Talking about crossing borders, Iran's team. I read that they will be allowed to play. They have 3 games in the first phase of the World Cup. They will be playing in LA and I think in somewhere else in the Western United States. But they won't be able to sleep in the United States. They're going to have to sleep in Tijuana, Mexico, because the government doesn't want them to sleep in the U.S. What is that about?
So I mentioned that there's almost a double standard for some of the teams and the fans. I mean, I'd like to actually speak first of all about the Iranian fans. And Iranian women fans were banned for decades from going to stadiums in Iran. So that's a major discrimination that FIFA did not act on. And women were jailed and died in the course of fighting for their rights. And it's also, this is the World Cup. And Iran always qualifies for the World Cup. So this was a foreseeable problem. What was not foreseeable was that the United States was going to launch a military action against Iran at the same time Iran had already qualified. So I think, and just to your question, so the games are the 15th of June in Los Angeles, the 21st of June in Los Angeles, and then in Seattle. So they're entirely on the US West Coast, which puts we have to think of these games as being a workplace. It's a workplace for players. It's a workplace. The Iranian journalists should have a right to cover these games as well. And also, just one other thing, because of the human rights abuses and restrictions on civil society in Iran, the World Cup has for years been a place where Iranian activists, particularly women's rights activists, could safely advocate for their rights. So it's actually also the restrictions on fans and women fans in particular is denying them a right to free speech around these events. So I think there are several layers of very clear discrimination, and FIFA is not defending the rights of the Iran national team. One other thing I think I have to mention here, because Human Rights Watch has written to FIFA about this. You may remember the Iran women's national team. Several of them sought asylum in Australia when they were playing at the AFC tournament. So recently, the Iranian authorities have put in place an asset confiscation for past famous national team players, including Masoud Shojai and Ali Karimi, two of the most famous living players from Iran. So the government has put in place asset confiscations to bankrupt them, but clearly it's intended to intimidate the current national team who protested crackdowns, the Masa Amini crackdown at the Qatar World Cup. Now, I'm worried I'm talking too much, but I do want to say that this shows you all of how human rights are intersecting and interrelated.
Yeah.
Both the Iran national team faces repression from their own government and from the US government, and this is completely wrong in the context of the World Cup or in any other context.
Yeah, especially sports. They're supposed to be about something else. Okay, so let's move on to our next speaker. Thank you so much, Minky. And that is Katherine Lapuente, Children's Rights Senior Coordinator at Human Rights Watch, who will also talk to us about some areas that she covers. Katherine, welcome.
Thanks so much, Pilar, and great to be here. My name is Katherine Lapuente, and I'm the Senior Children's Rights Coordinator at Human Rights Watch. At Human Rights Watch, with my team here in the organization, we have worked to document and expose risks to children's rights and risks to immigrant communities in the context of mega sporting events, particularly the World Cup. We are concerned that this upcoming World Cup that's starting in a few weeks risks being defined by a lack of comprehensive safeguarding protections for children, and it also risks being defined by exclusion and fear for immigrant communities. Over the last year, Human Rights Watch, alongside other human rights groups, have been calling on FIFA to pass a comprehensive child safeguarding policy to ensure that children related to the operations of these games, planning to attend these games, and in the context of these games, are protected from any risks to their rights, protected from any abuse during the operation of these games. Some of the risks to children in the context of mega sporting events and such as the World Cup include human trafficking, sexual exploitation, child labor, forced family separation, and displacement, among other concerns to children and their rights. Only recently, in the last few weeks, has FIFA taken steps to pass and to develop a child safeguarding statement and an overall safeguarding policy. And while these are positive steps, we fear that it's too little and too late for this current World Cup that's starting in just a few weeks. We're concerned that there's not enough time to implement all of these measures to ensure that staff that are responsible for delivering this World Cup are adequately trained, are adequately informed of the risks to children, and are able to respond to them effectively. We have concerns that reporting mechanisms are not accessible enough, or fans, including children or children in other contexts related to the World Cup, will not be adequately informed of reporting mechanisms. And we also are concerned of any possible remedy by FIFA to respond to any abuses that come up. Some like tangible risks that we've seen. A few months ago, Human Rights Watch documented and exposed a case of a father who loved soccer, was seeking asylum and safety in the United States. He had taken his two young kids, both 10 and 14, one 10 years old, one 14 years old, to the Club World Cup final last summer. While waiting for the start of the game, he and his children were in the stadium parking lot outside of MetLife Stadium in northern New Jersey. And was flying a recreational drone to take a photo of him and his family. Unfortunately, he was arrested by ICE in front of his children as they cried as they watched him be taken away from them, forcibly separating them from their father. He was eventually detained at Delaney Hall in northern New Jersey and Newark, New Jersey, where just this week we have seen people at Delaney Hall go on a hunger strike to protest the deplorable conditions there. And there are reports of ongoing abuse and retaliation against these people in detention. This father who Human Rights Watch interviewed and met with, was detained at Delaney for 3 months, and eventually forced to return to his country of origin, where he faces persecution by the very same people who forced him to flee in the first place. And this case really exemplifies the risks not only to children, but also to immigrant communities. Based on data provided by the Deportation Data Project, Human Rights Watch analyzed and found that over 167,000 people were arrested since January 2025 in the 11 U.S. host cities where the World Cup will take place in just a few weeks, with really egregious numbers coming out of places like Miami, Dallas, Houston. And these risks are not only for, these arrests have also left lasting marks and lasting impacts on the communities where these where these events will take place in the host cities. We have talked to rapid responders and groups in different U.S. host cities who have discussed the fear and the pervasive fear among immigrant communities, children really scared to go to school, families scared to leave their homes. And this World Cup really risks exacerbating those dangers for immigrant communities and for children. Human Rights Watch has called on FIFA to ensure that these safeguarding policies for all affected groups are adequately implemented, that staff are appropriately trained in responding to any risks to children in the context of these games, that immigrant communities are protected. We've been calling on FIFA to discuss, to talk, and put pressure on the U.S. administration to pass this ICE truce to limit immigration and immigration enforcement during the context of these games, and also end these cooperation agreements, these ICE 287G agreements between ICE and local law enforcement, in order to protect communities. So really just bringing this together, I think this case that Human Rights Watch has documented of the father who was arrested, detained and deported to his country of origin really shows the risks to children, children of immigrant backgrounds, communities in the host cities, immigrant communities in particular. And it's really important that this World Cup needs to raise the bar for human rights and not lower it, not contribute to additional lasting harm in these communities.
Thank you, Katherine. Henrietta Burrows, ask your question, please. Henrietta.
What happened to the two children whose father was arrested, and to children like those children when their parents are taken away?
Those children are still undergoing their asylum case. As you know, all asylum applications had been suspended, and only recently, in the last few weeks, has that suspension been lifted. They're still waiting for a decision on the case and whether they're able to remain in the United States and seek safety. But you can imagine the lasting damage and harm that will result for these children. That has resulted in, the lasting mental health impacts on these children since the separation and deportation of the father, but also going forward of not having their father present, the burden on their families for losing their primary breadwinner. And so, we really we don't want this to happen to other families.
Were they returned to their mother?
Eventually, they were. They had been left behind with others at the Club World Cup final that day, just showing another risk and like something that FIFA hadn't thought through in their child safeguarding policies of what would happen to children if their parents were arrested at these games. Thankfully, they did make it back to their mother safely, but there are concerns, going forward, if this does happen again, what will happen to the children if they're forcibly separated from their family members.
Caesar Nukum was asking, don't you regard this FIFA World Cup as diversionary tactic for the Trump administration not to attend to most pressing matters of the state, especially since Trump was already awarded the FIFA Peace Prize last December? Or do you regard this event as a much needed relief from many stressing issues affecting the U.S.? Either Minky or Katherine?
I think this World Cup should be a moment of celebration for families, for people who love soccer, bringing together communities. I really see so much excitement, and I'm based in New York City. I see so much excitement and enthusiasm from fans, from the communities. But the risks of the lack of safeguarding policies, the risks of the abuses that the United States government is perpetrating in these communities really risks jeopardizing and limiting that excitement, that sense of excitement and celebration that should be for families.
If I can add just on the sport, there was also a sports washing question embedded there. And I mean, we call it sports washing. So to make clear, this is really the Trump administration weaponizing, as Katherine says, an event beloved by billions of people to cover up ongoing repression in the United States. And I think that is really a danger, that this World Cup could become a sports washing bonanza for the Trump administration, when at the same time there are knocks on the door separate. We also, just a heads up for journalists, we will have a report, a very long report on the ICE activities in Minneapolis this year. and killings of American citizens. I think every person who is attending this World Cup and watching the final should remember when they see Donald Trump at the World Cup, they should remember the killings of Renee Peretti, Alex Good, the targeting of the racially based targeting of immigrant communities. So I think that's the real danger, is that this beloved event will be weaponized by the Trump administration to cover up, gloss over, and bury the terrible human rights abuses that have happened over the last year.
Okay, let's move on to our third speaker, and he is Jamal Watkins. He's Senior Vice President of Strategy and Advancement at the NAACPe. Jamal, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Pilar, and to my colleagues. We understand that in this moment, the civil society here in the United States and globally is standing on the right side of right around protecting diverse communities. My name is Jamal Watkins, and I serve as the Senior Vice President of Strategy and Advancement at the NAACP, one of America's largest and oldest civil and human rights organizations. We are 117 years old and in 2,600 plus local communities here in the United States. As you already have heard, imagine, if you will, as many as 10 million visitors to the United States for what is the world's largest sporting event in history. And it's shrouded in this backdrop of major concerns across workers' rights, security, immigration, public health, high cost, you name it. We're really struggling with this notion of what does it mean to address the heightened threats of First Amendment expression suppression, think for the general public and for journalists alike, the potential travel and immigration enforcement nightmares that we are planning to offset, shorthand for, connected to ICE, human rights abuses, and what we would describe as literally a focus on profits and not people. You hear folks time and time again talk about the fans and the players and this needing to be really about a celebratory experience, but we know the backdrop is hyper political and not where we would want it to be. So for the NAACP, our advocacy focuses in on three primary objectives. The first is this notion of inclusion and safeguarding. That, over the years, we have been advocating with our partners that we have to promote a comprehensive set of racial equity standards to ensure that the tournament remains safe, but it also is an inclusive environment for all players, journalists, fans, and the communities that these events are happening within. Then there's a bucket around workers' rights. And we know that past has taught us that, if we don't protect the labor rights of those constructing the venues, preparing for the games themselves, and operating during the World Cup itself in terms of the facilities, that there's going to be abuses, if you will. And then the notion of access to remedy. What happens, in terms of providing avenues for recourse if human rights standards are violated during the games. And so when we think about this, it sounds like the onslaught of the perfect makings of negativity. But what we found is that with our coalition and advocates, we decided, as you know, to issue a travel advisory. That was really a warning for fans, players, journalists, and other visitors coming to the 2026 FIFA Men's World Cup that there could be risk of serious human rights violations, especially considering ICE's involvement in the tournament and their pattern of violence. Now, of course, the U.S. government and U.S. intelligence and FIFA officials have said, oh, well, there's this increased potential for civil unrest and extremist attacks due to the heightened global and domestic tensions that we see, which is a sort of red herring or a trigger warning that you're going to see militarization and enforcement happening in a way like never before. We also know that there is a funding shortage. Now, it doesn't mean that there's not money in the World Cup ecosystem, but host cities have struggled to balance the massive security bills with cities really, identifying funding gaps. Even the FBI has lifted up that there are major concerns around cyber threats and drone strikes and lone wolf attacks. Again, what does that signal? That there has to be more federal presence and federal enforcement. And so in our meetings and push and pull, federal agents have said, no, we're going to primarily focus on counterfeit merchandise and investigating that, or ticket fraud, and even human trafficking, which is important. But we also were pushing back on this notion of ICE enforcement. Now, officials in the ICE agency are saying they're not going to do, mass roundups or it's really going to be targeted operations for what they call severe offenders, or those who commit other crimes. But we've seen how that's played out here in the United States. As Minky and others have lifted up, it's been the loss of life of civilians, it's been violence, targeting, families being ripped apart, and even to the point where participating countries like Germany and the UK have discouraged travel to the US, and players' unions have actively demanded assurances that ICE will not target attendees or stadium staff. And then when you layer on the entry bans, aggressive social media scrutiny and travel bans, it affects nearly, I would say, 3 dozen countries that have deterred many international supporters from traveling. When you layer in health and safety risks, because, at the end of the day, players have to play in venues with open air roofs, workers have to work those facilities, there's going to be extreme heat. When you think about travel related health concerns that have to be tackled, the cocktail is literally, in our opinion, it's putting profits above people. And so for us, we really want to make sure that we're encouraging attendees first and foremost to take steps to practically and pragmatically protect themselves. Things like, securing electronic devices by removing facial recognition capabilities. I know that sounds like going backwards in terms of protecting yourself, but yes, we know that that is something folks have to do pragmatically, or alerting families and friends around your travel patterns and travel plans, and so that you know where you're going to be just in case there is a extrajudicial disappearance crisis that happens. And so the pushback we are also seeing is from our friends in the hospitality and food service sector. We learned from some unions that are staffing the SoFi Stadium that they have threatened to strike if ICE agents are actively deployed inside venues. And so this notion of pushback has to happen because, as many of us have lifted up, we didn't get very far with FIFA and the US government in terms of making sure that funding was invested in addressing all of these concerns at the highest level, because again, profits were put over people. And I would argue at the end of this, for the NAACP and our partner organizations, we want folks to learn about what's happening in their cities and surrounding communities connected to World Cup. Be aware. And for those of you on this Zoom, you can visit naacp.org, where we have our official statement. We passed a resolution back in 2024 that gave a little more in-depth analysis around our stance. But overall, our goal is to align around the fact that we want to make sure that the experience for fans, players, community, and workers is at the highest level, because the next World Cup will be predicated on what happens here in the US and in North America. And I'll stop there.
Let's see. Aitana Vargas, she is asking, host cities will see prices spike during the World Cup. Are there any reports of the negative financial impact this event will have on most vulnerable local communities struggling to make ends meet for food, rent, or healthcare?
Well, and I think Minky lifted this up. Imagine, if you will, when there is a Super Bowl in a city, there's a lot of economic capital that gets infused into the city and into the surrounding environments. But the question is, who profits from those economic spikes? Meaning, is it, business owners, high net worth individuals? When you think about it, we got reports, for example, that folks who have to travel from New York City to the Met Stadium, the travel to get there on public transportation and other means is skyrocketing as high as $150 one way. But that doesn't necessarily go into the pockets of local community members, individual workers, and folks who live in those communities. And so what we have been arguing is that there has to be better project labor agreements, better community benefit agreements. And because we are so close to the games actually happening, none of that happened at scale in the right way everywhere. So I think what we will see is that money will flow from the games, but it'll flow into corporations and entities that are large in scope and not necessarily meet the community needs and investment needs of the hyperlocal communities that these games are taking place in, or hitting the bank accounts of the workers who are in those communities who need the real bump up.
It's very sad that most of the profits will go to the corporations. So my question, however, is that the advocacy that's taking place, I was not really aware, for example, about the risk involved, especially for our immigrant communities, undocumented communities. We know that ICE targets these days, or the administration targets legal, and everybody is game. So what efforts have been made to reach the smaller advocacy groups so they can inform their communities better, because I know a lot of small businesses, mom and pops, who try to take advantage to make some money during this time. Are there any efforts to sensitize these communities of how they can balance profitability or entertainment vis-a-vis the risk of ice rounding and separating and all these atrocious things that we're expecting?
I'll take a first cut at it, and then colleagues, please lean in. So for the NAACP and our partner organizations, we work with entities and infrastructure that's hyperlocal. So NAACP, it's 2,600 NAACPs in cities, on campuses, and in communities. So for our ecosystem, it's been around messaging and framework so that the folks who live in a community, whether you're in the New York metro area or the Boston metro area or in Dallas or Houston, you know what's happening in terms of the World Cup coming to your community and also what the risks are. We also are part of a range of coalition spaces that include, say, networks like State Voices, which is state table infrastructure. Think 2,000 hyperlocal organizations across the country here in the US. And that ecosystem is being flooded with continually information around what to do, what's at stake, what to watch for. And especially given the heightened sort of ICE conflicts that have happened, there are thousands of local organizations who are really in lock and step with us. And then, of course, the labor movement. When you think about the AFL-CIO and America's unions that represent more than 13 million working people, unions are also all over the country and hyperlocal and have been active in places like Seattle and in Texas and Atlanta in getting the word out and making sure that working people and business communities know what the benefits are of the World Cup coming to their community, but what are the risks, especially as it relates to human rights violations, worker rights needs, etc. Now, the issue is that it's not a perfect ecosystem. We need you all as reporters and journalists to spread the real news, to tell the right stories, and to make sure that we keep amplifying so that we're countering any mis and disinformation. Because somebody got a peace prize who's not all about peace, for example. So we need to continue that drumbeat so that local folks are empowered and informed and know what to do and not to do given the games coming to their communities. That's my take on it, but I'm sure our colleagues may have other ways in which we've been really pushing the message and the narrative.
Yeah, just one. I'm also putting some relevant links in the chat as Jamal speaks, but including on the unions fight for decent pay. And I just want to go, to say that this was also a requirement for the 16 host cities to publish a mandatory human rights action plan. And as part of that action plan, they were all required to, I mean, it's just like, I'm a teacher. It drives me crazy. As many as 5 of the cities haven't done their homework. They get Fs. They haven't turned anything in. They haven't, we're 2 weeks out and they haven't published any human rights action plans. But what that means is they didn't do their homework. They didn't sit down with the people most affected, the local communities. And I will say that we have some indications that, like Vancouver and Toronto, that, by the way, Toronto hasn't published its action plan either, but we know that they did sit down and to try to make space for the local workers or indigenous communities to actually benefit from the World Cup. So the basic rule is that these mega events shouldn't happen to a community. They should happen with a community. And it's just an enormous missed opportunity, including that many of the host cities, and I'm going to call out here Philadelphia, Miami, where FIFA's based, have simply not published their human rights action plans at all. New York, New Jersey. I mean, this is shocking that 2 weeks before, these mandatory documents documenting how they engage with stakeholders have not been published.
Thank you, Minky. Let's move on to our final speaker, and thank you for your patience waiting. Ariel Ruiz Soto, Senior Policy Analyst at the Migration Policy Institute. Welcome.
Thank you, Pilar, and it's great to be with all of you, especially given the importance of this information and your role in trying to report what's happening. I'm going to try to keep brief, and I think Minky and the other panelists have already covered many of the points that I think are most important about the immigration perspective. So I'm just going to hone in on a few of them. But first, let me try to underscore the point that this FIFA World Cup was intended or is intended to be the largest, not just because FIFA says, but also because of the number of participants that will be here. And initially, when the bid was created, it was supposed to be the most unifying World Cup because they had three countries that were playing or bidding together to try to conduct this World Cup. The circumstances have clearly changed. The United States and Mexico and Canada are actually in significant political disagreements over the last several months, if not the last year, including not just sporting events, but also things like the USMCA, security conditions. The President Trump saying that potentially could include Canada and the United States in the future, or suggesting that they may be able to go and enter to help or to do some operations for security within Mexican territory. So the context is different than it was when the three countries came together, but it's meant to continue, or it's meant to emphasize that the unity is still the thing that soccer continues to unify the world. And that's been the focus of the FIFA organization. As Minky suggested, the majority of the games will be in the United States, and I think we should talk about the United States, but clearly it's important to also consider when talking about immigration, how folks will be traveling to Mexico or Canada and what the conditions there will be as well, not just the United States. 78% of the games of the World Cup are going to be played in the United States, and that's what we should talk about it, but we should also be paying close attention to how Mexico and Canada will actually respond to some of the same or different issues that they've seen. The first thing then to get into the focus of this is looking at international travel. And I think Jamal also pointed this out. One of the key components that's going to make this perspective, or at least experience, unique for people choosing to travel to the United States to watch or be part of the World Cup games is that there is a different set of conditions that will come together and policies that will make that travel difficult. First, let's look at the travel bans that went into effect last year that affect 39 countries that will be coming or could potentially come to see the games, including specifically Cote d'Ivoire, Haiti, Iran, and Senegal, whose fans would not be able to travel to the United States unless they had a previous visa before the 2025 prohibitions. Among those countries, especially for all you to know, are primarily countries from Africa and from some parts in Asia that make it specifically travel harder for them. One of the key reasons why these travel bans were put into place was because of arguments that these countries from where migrant or people could come from did not have sufficient verification in their process. Either they did not have reciprocal agreements of the security of that travel, and in some cases, they were trying to persuade those governments to take back immigrants from their own countries. So, for example, an African country previously saying that they wouldn't take deportees back from the United States from those places. In the end, these four countries will be the most affected, but again, the total 39 may be as well. This sets us up for a conversation about how there's uneven regulations about travel to the United States. The key point to make about this unevenness is that for some countries from Europe and from Asia who are part of the visa waiver program, the conditions are going to be relatively simple. People are still going to be able to come to the United States from these countries, though they may face some criteria or changes once they come and land at an airport where CBP still has to make a determination for them to be able to come into the United States. That's still going to be a criteria, but it just wouldn't be the same. In addition to that, there is also the announcement that the Trump administration made that there will be up to a $15,000 bond for people to pay, for some people to pay, to be able to enter the United States to assure that they will actually leave the country once the World Cup ended, or once they leave, in this case, the World Cup. The only exception to this, and this was just done a couple of weeks ago, was that people would be exempt from this $15,000 essentially deposit, that if they applied or got tickets to and planned to travel before April 15th of this year. So for anybody that applied or sought to do that afterwards, they'll still be essentially subject to this potential bond from particular countries. That makes it even more difficult for people from countries that are not subject to bans, but could or want to go and or come to the United States to be able to watch the games. That would make it significantly more difficult. The final component in terms of travel is that even once immigrants, or in this case, the teams also who are banned potentially in some places from coming, that will also mean differences for people who come with them. So, for example, there's a really good report by Albert Samaha who looked at how Haitian players are actually thinking of coming to the United States for the World Cup, not just by themselves, but also with their family members who may not be able to make that travel because of the bans that we have in the United States so far. And so these compounding factors will make it difficult to have that experience for fans, but also for, in general, the people who will support the teams that we're hoping to come to the United States. And that unevenness is an important aspect of it. We saw that the administration did create a mechanism to try to get expedite some of the consular appointments through a process called FIFA Pass that would allow people who have access to a visa or need a visa to enter the United States to be able to do it more quickly. But that process, the latest that I saw, only had about 16,000 people who had applied to the FIFA Pass as of late last month. That means that the majority of the people that would need a visa would and are seeking to do it more efficiently may actually be a small number of the fraction of people that are coming abroad from the into the United States. The last thing I'll say about the travel conditions here is that this will mean that, for example, for not just the team of Iran, but also people and supporters of Iran, it may be easier for them to travel and see a game in Mexico or in Canada than to see one in the United States. And even though Iran, if Iran makes it to the beyond the group stage, that will make it significantly difficult, but exposes the differences between the three countries, each of them with different immigration policies. The last point I'll make here before taking your questions is about the enforcement. Many of my fellow panelists have covered the enforcement. But I do want to be clear that so far, the Trump administration, at least indirectly through reports, has said that they will not have enforcement at or around the stadiums. We had followed similar statements about the Super Bowl, for example, when it was held in Santa Clara this year, that a lot of people thought that maybe would have ICE presence or protests around there. There were some protests, but there wasn't any, at least that I'm aware of, any verified activity of specifically targeted arrests during the Super Bowl. And we expect something similar will be the case around the stadiums. But the point that I think Jamal and others are making is broader than that. It's not just around the stadiums, but in fact across the cities and the states that they're located in, because FIFA is also hosting what they have these host cities and areas across the states that they're hosting to try to get people who cannot go to the games directly to have some of these events and essentially parties for people to come and watch together and celebrate together the event. It hasn't been clear yet what would be, if any, enforcement happening around those areas too. And if that will be the case, what extent that will likely be, or in terms of the reach of that component. I think this presents a lot of attention to the local jurisdictions and the state jurisdictions to try to understand what it will be like. Every FIFA host city has a committee that is supposed to organize in lead up to the organization of the games, and we would expect that some of these organizations or this hosts city committees are talking about that with FIFA to try to ensure where that will be the case. So again, most of the focus so far has been about the enforcement in the interior or the travel from the international participants, and I think it's going to be a different layer of components that would really define not just the World Cup, but also the Special Olympics that are to be happen this summer in the United States, and then later in Los Angeles for the Summer Olympics in 2028. So I'll leave it there and see if you have questions.
I wanted to ask you as an aside, because this is not directly on the topic, but this latest report that the administration is thinking about pulling CBP agents from airports that are in sanctuary cities. What is that? Is that real?
Well, it is a consideration. Yes, it's a consideration that the DHS secretary has thought about making, which would mean that in so-called sanctuary cities, airports would then essentially not be able to host the same or process international travel. Say, for example, in San Francisco, that then people would not be able to travel, land, and go through the process. In general, that would mean that they then have to go to another. If they continue to make the travel, they will have to land in another airport. Operationally, that would be a nightmare. And let me be clear that DHS secretary has not said that this would happen before the World Cup. There's been mixed reports about that. So I think if it does happen, it will likely happen after the World Cup. And if it does happen, it likely will be significantly difficult for people to make that up as well in terms of travel going forward. But in general, that's generally the panorama that continues to change. We have to remember that the DHS secretary has just been there in his new role for a few months, and we'll likely see how that changes.
I would like to know is, do you consider that if the new UCIS rule requiring residency applicants to leave the country and go through the consular process is related to the possibility that some fans entering to the country on tourist visa for the World Cup might stay in the States? I maybe it could be a response to that possibility. What do you think? Thank you.
They're similar enough, but I think they're unrelated. The latest announcement that happened, which is mostly going to impact people who are trying to adjust their status and are married to a U.S. citizen going through the process, will be actually broader and likely even more difficult for people already in the United States. But this does point out to what I mentioned before about the travel bans that actually are in place for the people at 39 countries that will not be able to come to the United States unless they already had a visa before then those proclamations were announced. And that is the consideration that the Trump administration made, which said that these 39 countries were more likely than not to overstay their visas if they traveled to the United States, and therefore could not be trusted to give those visas to them. It's one of the three components that I mentioned to you, but it is certainly one of them. And the Trump administration has said that they're trying to reduce visa overstays by trying to have this limitations on visa travel for those 39 countries that I referred to earlier, including the 4 that are participating in the World Cup themselves.
What specific policy changes or administrative improvements are still needed to ensure that visa delays and border enforcement do not discourage lawful travelers from attending?
There's been a lot of, in the recent years and also under the Biden administration, and in fact, even under the previous Trump administration, a lot of potential congressional debates actually about what could be done to improve and provide more assistance to create those visa issuances faster and easier, but they haven't really gained much traction. And I think we have to say 2 things. One is that consular visa processing is already complicated. And the recent implementations by the Trump administration are actually making that process even more difficult for people that do want to come to the United States and meet all the requirements. At the same time, the visa under the current Trump administration in second term, what's become more difficult is there's been this idea of building reciprocity. And now visa issuances are not just about making logistically accessible to people to come, but making it a larger instrument in broader foreign diplomatic negotiations. You likely may know, for example, that some of the countries that have signed agreements to accept deportations of third country nationals are doing it because they're afraid of getting visa cancellations from the United States. And so the visa issuances and making the process improved has been an important part of the debate, but under the current Trump administration, it's actually become less about making the process smoother and more about negotiating and instrumenting these visas to make it more important or more reliable for whatever the Trump administration is seeking to do with foreign governments. There are some key criteria trying to make sure to go through security vetting easier, more quickly, making the consular process more predictable and transparent, and all those things could be helpful, but they're not the priority right now in terms of for State Department or the State Department has promised those would be the case.
We're going around the panel. Last words and thoughts, especially your advice on what we should be covering. But also, I want to point to this question just entered in the chat by Sandra Martinez. Will the Cup events benefit immigrants regardless of their immigration status? Will they be able to enjoy a moment of peace amid the violent actions of ICE? In other words, is it safe to enjoy the time?
So our position at Human Rights Watch is that there is no successful mega sporting event with a backdrop of human rights abuses that are as serious as we're discussing. This World Cup is not a World Cup for the world. I think Ariel and Jamal and Katherine have also covered this as well. Both the visa bans, the visa restrictions, and the horrific immigration enforcement that's separating families in the US means that people will not be able to enjoy this World Cup in the way that they should be able to. And that is both it's a shame and a missed opportunity, but it's also a violation of FIFA's own human rights requirements. So there is, even with 2 weeks left to go, a lot that could be done to force the US and other countries to uphold their human rights obligations around this World Cup.
As we've discussed, this event can really increase the risks that we're already seeing to children, to immigrant communities. It is not too late for FIFA to take immediate steps and to use their leverage and pressure on the United States government to improve and reduce the risk to these communities, and they should do so right away. We have just a couple of weeks left to go to use that time wisely.
Yes, no, thank you for this space. For the NAACP, we are very clear that our goal is to support the fans, the players, and working communities that bring the World Cup to life. And that means in many ways we have to balance out, the profits over people narrative, the political interests of the US government in certain cities to militarize communities and to abuse immigrant and migrant people in migrant communities, and to do what's best for women, children, men, and families. Because we know, as Minky said, the human rights issues as a backdrop undermines what the sport is about and what the World Cup is about. And we're fighting forward on that front. And with weeks left to go, we know that we need community to stand with us and on behalf of themselves to ensure that they get what they need and to really push back on what could be a nightmare scenario. So that, I would say, is really the call to action and where we are in this moment. But again, it's centering people and communities first.
Thank you. I think part of our conversation about research and what's happening policy-wise is to try to also note that similar concerns happened during the Super Bowl and that did not come to fruition. So I think we need to have communities know and be aware about their rights. But I would find it unlikely that a big or mass deportations or operations would happen during or at stadium and arenas. One of the reasons is because the Trump administration has said that they haven't or will not do it. Second, and that, though again, that's not necessarily the only reason. Second is because, if anything, the World Cup has been and is the largest watched event across the world. And the spotlight that would be placed on the administration if something like this were to happen, I think would be largely negatively, internationally negative for them. I think they're considering these factors. Yes, ICE may be present at the games where they have been before with previous Super Bowls, even under Democratic administrations. The question is, how far can the administration go to make some of those protections be more visible? And then what will be the response from the local and state authorities to ensure that that is the case? That's what we'll be focusing on at MPI.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all the panelists. It's been very informative. And thank you to all my colleagues who showed up today.